How are you, Alex? I saw you sitting there by your
Good evening, everyone. We are here today for another session of the Slaveryarchive Book Club, today with Stolen by Richard Bell. Then my name is Ana Lúcia Araújo, then professor at Howard University. My co-hosts in this book club are Jessica Johnson from Johns Hopkins University. She's not here today. Also Vanessa Holden from University of Kentucky, and
Alex Hill from the University of Columbia.
Okay, now, and we have Alex Hill, who is also with us, and who will be introducing our guest. And Alex is at Columbia University, and he is also the co-host of the Slaveryarchive Book Club. Then welcome, everybody.
Hi, thank you, Anna. Welcome, everybody. We're very honored to have with us today Richard Bell to talk about his book, Stolen. I'm going to be introducing him and quickly moving out of the way to let him talk to us a little bit about his book before we move to a conversation with all of you. We'll be taking questions on Zoom and also on YouTube or Twitter if you prefer to send your questions for Richard Bell that way. Now, Richard Bell is professor of history at the University of Maryland. He is the author of the new book, Stolen, 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home, which we're going to talk about today. The book is available in hardcover, paperback, Audible, audiobook, and Kindle, and it's a finalist for the 2020 George Washington Prize and the 2020 Harriet Tubman Prize. Rick has held major research fellowships at Yale, Cambridge, and the Library of Congress, and is the recipient of the National Endowment of the Humanities Public Scholar Award. Rick also serves as a trustee of the Maryland Historical Society, as an elected member of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, and as a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. And without further ado, let me move out of the way and give the mic to Rick Bell. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Anna. It's lovely to see other folks out here, friends and strangers alike. Thank you for being here on what is in the Washington, D.C. area, a bitterly cold Wednesday evening. And it's December. I'm surprised this many of us have made it this far, this deep into this crazy year, into this busy semester. So thank you for making time to talk about this scholarship and this book today. I was chatting with Anna and with Alex about the best way to proceed here. And I thought, given that we have an audience, which I take to be some people who've read the book and some people that haven't read the book, I thought I might give a sort of very abbreviated version of a book talk, laying some of the major themes and characters out in this book, which will take me all of 15 to 20 minutes. And then we'll be all on the same page and we can have a conversation from that common understanding. And we welcome all sorts of questions about any part of this. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We'll see if that works. Always a moment of truth for any Zoom presenter, as you guys all know now. So we're going to start right here and let's get talking. And if you know anything about this, you know, of course, it's very sobering stuff, like so much of the ground that we've covered in Slaveryarchive Book Club discussions so far. Because Cornelius Sinclair was 10 years old and he was trapped. He was stuck, he was locked in the belly of a small ship that looked a lot like this one, that was bobbing up and down in the middle of the Delaware River, a mile south of Philadelphia. A man had grabbed this 10-year-old kid from a spot near Philadelphia's market an hour ago, shoved a black gag across his mouth, tossed him into a wagon, and hauled him aboard. And it was dark below the ship's waterline, but Cornelius could see enough to know that he was not the only child locked down there. 4 pairs of eyes stared right back at him, 4 other black boys. One definitely younger than him, none of them older than 16. Yesterday, all 5 boys had been free, like you and me. But today they were slaves, prisoners of a gang of child snatchers who planned to sell their lives and their labor, most likely to plantation owners in the Deep South. If their abductors got away with this, 10-year-old Cornelius Sinclair would spend the rest of his life as someone else's property, somewhere very far away. He would probably never see his family again. Cornelius disappeared in late August 1825, one of dozens of African-American children to vanish in very similar circumstances from Philadelphia that single year alone. In the early 1800s, the city was the hub of American slavery's blackest market. Its gridded streets and its tangled alleys were hunting grounds for crews of professional kidnappers who made their livings turning free black kids like Cornelius into Southern slaves. And they did their work swiftly and shamelessly, in brazen affront to Philadelphia's reputation at the time as the city of brotherly love, but not only that, also as a safe haven for people of color and as the headquarters of America's anti-slavery movement. But to criminals, to kidnappers, of course, none of that stuff mattered. And in truth, early 19th century Philly was probably one of the most dangerous places to be free and black anywhere in the United States. And this was a product of its location. It was the nearest large, free, major city to the slave South. Philadelphia lay just 40 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line, the boundary that separated Pennsylvania's free soil from several slave states to the south, including Maryland, where I'm talking to you from right now. Philadelphia's proximity to that frontier line made its many free black residents attractive targets for professional people snatchers marauding from the slave states. They would prey on members of the city's free black community relentlessly, putting bullseyes on their backs and putting prices on their heads. And the people they stole away from freedom could fetch anywhere up to $15,000 per person in today's money in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, 3 of the new territories and states that were rising up along the Gulf Coast at exactly this time. The American settlers swarming into that region demanded a nearly bottomless supply of forced labor to cut sugarcane and pick cotton. And they would take almost anyone to do that unpaid work. Buying a small percentage of their black laborers from kidnappers of free people was not likely their first choice, but their options were circumscribed. Planters down there in the Deep South had been forced to look to American sources for their unfree manpower needs ever since 1808, the year that lawmakers in Washington, about 8 miles out my window, had passed legislation outlawing any further imports of black people from Africa or the Caribbean for the purposes of enslaving them in the United States. That 1808 decision turned out to be a major turning point in the history of slavery in America, because it spurred the growth of an American internal domestic slave trade within the United States. After that 1808 decision, interstate slave traders here in the United States tried to satisfy those Southwestern settlers' demands for black labor by bringing them thousands of American-born enslaved people each year from existing slave states like Maryland and Virginia, where some plantations were in surplus, in quotation marks. But settlers down in the Deep South wanted even more. And the stronger the demand, the more tempting and more profitable it became for anyone sufficiently cold-blooded to try to kidnap free children like Cornelius from northern cities, including Philadelphia, smuggle them into that legal supply chain, and then sell them in that vast new southwestern slave market. These economic incentives left Philadelphia's large and dynamic free Black community dangerously exposed. And by 1808, the city of brotherly love had become a center of an inter-regional kidnapping operation. It had become a northern terminus of something I call in my scholarship America's reverse Underground Railroad. So that's exactly what I've just described. It's the kidnapping and trafficking into slavery of free African Americans from within the United States. And this reverse Underground Railroad, and its much better known namesake, the Underground Railroad, they usually ran in opposite directions and existed for completely different purposes. But because they're opposites, they're also sort of mirror images of one another. On the Underground Railroad, so that's the good one, the famous one, the Harriet Tubman one, enslaved people would abandon southern plantations and trek usually northward, dreaming of new lives and new opportunities in freedom. On America's reverse Underground Railroad, free Black people would be stolen from northern cities like Philadelphia and be made to trudge southward to be sold into plantation slavery. Both of these two networks, one I think heroic and courageous, the other I think evil and monstrous, roared to life in the early 1800s to exploit what by then had become major differences in the legal status of slavery in the North and in the South. Both of these networks were loosely organized and opportunistic. Both of them ran on secrecy and relied on small circles of trusted participants, forged documents, false identities, even disguise. The direction of travel was often quite different, but the routes taken by freedom seekers and by victims of kidnapping were often the same, and they might even have passed one another on certain roads from time to time. And what's more, the volume of traffic on these two metaphorical railroads was roughly the same size. Each year, each one carried hundreds of Black adults and children across state lines. For those of us living in the United States, most of us know quite a lot about the Underground Railroad by now, the good one, the famous one. The achievements of folks like Harriet Tubman command our attention, which is great, and there are walking tours, television shows, and museums. And of course, that recent movie, Harriet. Do you remember a time, Alex, when you could go to a movie theater and sit with strangers? What a wonderful time that was. November 19, you could see this movie in theaters, Harriet. All of this stuff dedicated to celebrating the men and women who created the secret network through which the enslaved could escape to freedom, the Underground Railroad. We know far less, I would argue, about America's reverse Underground Railroad. Its conductors and station agents worked tirelessly to remain untouchable. And the identities of all but a handful of these criminals still remain a secret, even today. They certainly never gave public lectures about their work or went on fundraising tours. Only rarely do their names and crimes even appear in police files or trial transcripts. Their low profile in surviving legal sources, the result of the years they spent in the shadows, protected by bribes, by corruption, by too much apathy and indifference among ordinary Americans who knew what they were doing and turned a blind eye. They left no business records, no bundles of private letters. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't pose for paintings or photographs, leaving journalists and activists to guess, as you see here, at what they might have looked like. But as I argue in this recent book, Stolen, the kidnappers who built America's reverse Underground Railroad left their mark everywhere, stealing away, all told, maybe tens of thousands of free Black people, many of them children like Cornelius. And let me be clear, most of those they kidnapped were never heard from again. Their families and friends searched frantically, lobbied, petitioned, advertised. They waited in earnest for news, but usually nothing came. Free Black people in northern cities like Philly had few white allies in this period beyond the meager ranks of a handful of Quaker-led anti-slavery societies. And what's more, white employers openly discriminated against African-American job applicants, while city constables generally ignored people of color's complaints. So when children like Cornelius went missing, their parents could hardly ever persuade mayors, magistrates, policemen to get involved. It was rarer still for anyone to be able to gather enough evidence to issue arrest warrants, search property, and interrogate suspects. And even then, experienced members of these many different kidnapping crews knew exactly what to do and what to say to talk their way out of trouble and get back to work. I'm guessing every single one of you watching this has heard of 12 Years a Slave. As you'll remember, 12 Years a Slave was the name of a movie based on a memoir written by a guy named Solomon Northup, who of course was one of the thousands, if not tens of thousands, of victims of America's reverse Underground Railroad. Unlike almost everyone else, though, Northup later escaped his kidnapping and enslavement, although it took him how many years? 12 years to do it. When he did, he returned home and then he wrote about it all. And in that memoir, 12 Years a Slave, which he wrote in 1853, Northup explains what riding America's reverse Underground Railroad was like for him. He explains how a pair of well-dressed white conmen lured him, a well-educated, prosperous musician in his mid-30s, into New York City from his home upstate in New York in 1841. In Manhattan, they wined him, dined him, and if you remember the movie, they drugged him and then sold him to an interstate slave trader in Washington, D.C. Northup was soon forced onto a slave ship bound for New Orleans, and there he was sold in one of that city's infamous slave showrooms to a planter who then put him to work in his sugarcane fields. In 2013, that Oscar-winning film, so powerful, everyone should see it, based on Northup's extraordinary autobiography, drew overdue attention to his ordeal. But both the memoir and the movie offer distorted, perhaps even misleading views of who the agents of America's reverse Underground Railroad usually targeted and how they usually made their money. Because it turns out that Northup's experience on America's reverse Underground Railroad was not at all typical of everyone else's. Its kidnappers rarely approached highly literate, middle-aged men like Northup. They preferred instead to lure away poorly educated street kids with ruses that could swiftly separate them from their families. Very few of their captives traveled by ship to New Orleans either. Instead, kidnappers forced most boys and girls to trek southward on foot in small, specialized overland convoys known as coffles. And their prisoners rarely ended up in showrooms or on the auction block. They were vastly more likely to be sold off along the way in furtive all-cash deals to hard-up planters in the interior of Mississippi, Alabama, to men who wanted to buy more slaves, but who were too cheap to pay big city New Orleans slave prices. All of that was what was typical. And all of that is almost exactly what happened to Cornelius Sinclair, one of the 5 central figures in this book. In August of 1825, Cornelius and Sam and Enos and Alex and Joe, along with 2 adult women, fell into the hands of 19th century America's most fearsome gang of kidnappers. Their captors hustled them onto a ship just outside Philadelphia, And Philadelphia, of course, is in the top right of this map. Their captors warehoused them for a while in a pair of safe houses down on the Delaware-Maryland line. If you can see the word Nanticoke at the bottom of your screen and a black dot, that black dot is where those safe houses were. And then their captors marched them onward, halfway across this vast continent, towards the Deep South, where they tried to sell all these people as slaves. This was a soul-destroying journey, a journey of 2 million children's footsteps. In interest of time, I have to pass over it here, though I'm happy to return to it in Q&A. Likewise, I'm going to pass over the book's second half, in which some, but not all, of these 5 boys engineer a miraculous escape and begin the astonishing Odyssey home to Philadelphia, tantalizingly referred to in my book's subtitle. An Odyssey that would ultimately encompass 2 murders, 3 exhumations of dead bodies, an escape, a recapture, a suicide, a race riot, a lawsuit, the nation's first most wanted list, and America's largest manhunt so far. But instead of spilling all the beans, I hope folks will check out the book. Let me wrap up my prepared remarks here with a couple of brief reflections about why I think learning about America's reverse Underground Railroad is important. To begin with, I would argue forcefully that Black lives have always mattered. And so any true story about free children ripped from their families and swallowed up by American slavery is worth reconstructing and telling for its own damning sake. But the remarkable ordeal that Cornelius and his 4 fellow captives endured also demands all of our attention, I think, for many other reasons. For one thing, it serves as a pointed reminder that in the decades before the American Civil War, child snatching was heartbreakingly frequent in northern towns and cities, and Black freedom was achingly fragile. It demonstrates, too, the important role that this grotesque trade in kidnapped free people played in accelerating the spread of American slavery into the Deep South over the same period. Now, as I said, I don't normally spill all the beans about the book's astonishing second half, but I will drop a few big hints right here and right now and say that the dogged efforts of all those involved in trying to save Cornelius and these other boys and women from the horrors of slavery in the Southwest would have profound consequences, radicalizing Black communities across the free states and inspiring African Americans to embrace bold new tactics in the cause of their own self-defense and mutual protection. Their efforts would reshape the rest of the American anti-slavery movement as well, by encouraging abolitionists like the 2 women who wrote this children's anti-slavery alphabet to focus the Northern reading public's attention on the suffering of Black families being forcibly separated by kidnappers, by slave catchers, by slave traders, by slavery itself. But most immediately, outrage over the abduction of these 5 boys would force lawmakers in Pennsylvania to pass a tough, new anti-kidnapping measure known as a personal liberty law. And that 1826 Pennsylvania personal liberty law would enrage Southerners and slaveholders more so than any other state law passed before the Civil War, and would set in motion a chain of court challenges and political retaliations against it that culminated in the passage through Congress of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a pro-slavery abomination of a law that put this country on a collision course with civil war. But that important, lasting legacy must never be allowed to obscure the urgent stakes of this particular story. a 10-year-old boy, Cornelius Sinclair, and 4 other free children were dragged into slavery in 1825. They would have to fight like hell to try to escape. So let me stop there, folks. On this last slide, again, in the service of getting this to as many people as possible, I'm doing what my publisher taught me, which is to advertise the book, which is to remind you it's available in different formats. And if anyone wants to actually get a signed copy, you can write to me directly. But with that, I'm going to turn things back to Alex and proceed as he instructs.
Thank you very much, Rick. Now we are going to start taking questions and having a conversation with each other. I mean, you know, I enjoyed this book so much that I kind of wanted him to keep talking a little bit about the end. And I'm pretty sure that during the question and answer session, we're going to have to give some spoilers, because there's so many tentacles to this story, so many things we can latch onto. And I, for one, have a question that involves that second half. But I will move myself out of the way in the beginning to let you in the audience ask your questions. So if anybody has any questions that wants to get us started with, please raise your hand or write the question on the Zoom chat. I'll be happy to ask it for you, but I encourage you to ask your question directly to Rick, to turn on your camera and turn on your mic and engage in conversation with the author. Who wants to get us started?
Okay, I would just ask Rick to stop sharing the screen like this. You can see if there is anybody else. Okay, we have Alex. Okay. I would have a question, because in the last talk that we had with Rick, I was not able to ask this question, and I have here, because I took notes just to not say any titles wrong. But one of the issues that we ask ourselves is that, of course, we know about the fact that this internal domestic slave trade has been around then after the end of the African slave trade to the United States. Then this we have records about this story and multiple cases. I ask myself why in these last very few years we had this very big number, I would say, of new history monographs focusing on the domestic slave trade. Then your monograph is Stolen. I was seeing then just before the publication of yours, we had Jeff Forrett, Williams Gang, a notorious slave trader, and his cargo of Black convicts. We had published almost simultaneously with your book, the book by Caleb McDaniel, Sweet Taste of Liberty, that he had won the Pulitzer Prize. Then we just had recently, a few weeks ago, Jonathan Daniel Wells, who published Kidnapping Club, Wall Street Slavery and Resistance on the Eve of the Civil War. And we have Joshua Rothman, who is also publishing a book on the domestic slave trade. I ask myself why now we have this growing interest of US historians on this topic.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I'm so glad you were able to name check some of the great historiography that's come out around kidnapping narrowly and the legal domestic slave trade more largely here. And there's a few things going on here. In no particular order, I would say that, you know, since the 1980s, there has been increasing scholarly interrogation of capitalism as a phenomenon and the different manifestations of capitalism in American, British, Caribbean, transatlantic history, among many other contexts. And so it's been an outgrowth of that interest in interrogating capitalism that we've started to, I think, recognize and unpack the obviously capitalistic dimensions of American slavery. And so one obvious dimension of American slavery is transactional, right? Is the buying and selling of slaves, which was entirely legal in the American South in the 1830s and used to be entirely legal in the American North as well before the Revolution and soon afterwards, just so we're clear. So I think that has brought an attention to the domestic slave trade, because as Walter Johnson, who's now at Harvard University, wrote in his brilliant and beautiful book, Soul by Soul, American slavery is the chattel principle. It's the idea that a person can bear a price, that a person can be bought or sold, that a person is an asset, as well as a machine to labor, but an asset that can be traded. That can be speculated upon, that can be mortgaged. And so I think, neo-Marxism has really brought that critique of slavery to the front. And I think Walter Johnson is a big part of that. And in the UK, Michael Tadman's book, Speculators and Slaves, did something very similar a few years earlier. So we're living through a golden age of these studies of slavery as capitalism and capitalism as slavery. So of course, the transactional nature of slavery is coming into the foreground, not just in the formal market, which is the legal trading and buying and selling of slaves, but in the informal market. And I hesitate to use this word, but in the black market of slavery here, right? So criminal trafficking of free people into slavery, smuggling of people in violation of international laws after 1808. This is the sort of informal economy, right? The, again, to use the unfortunate wording, the black market. The other part of this, I think, Anna, is to say that in slavery times, meaning prior to the Civil War, there were decades and decades of efforts by Southerners, particularly those who themselves owned slaves, to paint themselves and portray themselves to the public and in print in particular ways. And one of the most common portrayals, and one that's gained remarkable traction over the years, is of American slavery as paternalism, the idea that the master is a father figure for enslaved people, that like his wife, like his children, they are dependents and members of his extended family, and that he cares for them. And of course, he doesn't mistreat them. This is a pro-slavery myth, and it's very insidious. And it has endowed to us in the present and in the centuries since the Civil War, the idea that plantations were idyllic places. You can have your weddings at many beautiful looking manicured properties in the South, which identify as historic homes and plantations, which I think many of us would call slave labor camps. Do you want to have your wedding at what's, in the dictionary definition, a concentration camp? That doesn't sound quite as appealing, does it? But the legacy of paternalism as a fantasy of slave ownership has been very insidious. And because of paternalism, we have for too long forgotten that enslaved people were bought and sold all the time, that they weren't living with one benevolent master for decades, from womb to tomb, from cradle to grave, as part of his extended and benevolent family. That in fact, as Walter Johnson, Michael Tadman, and many, many other people, Ed Baptist, have told us, they were being bought and sold, transferred across small distances and large distances with great ferocity and with great profit to many people. So pushback against that, I think, has revealed just how widespread the legal domestic slave trade was. And now, as you pointed out, Anna, a second generation of scholars here, John Wells at Michigan, Jeff Forrett, Caleb McDaniel at Rice University, and myself and many other people as well, who I hope I get a chance to talk about as well, have been saying that actually the kidnapping of free people into slavery was a significant part of this. It's hard to speculate on its percentage role in regard to the legal domestic slave trade, but we can document hundreds, if not thousands of cases, and we're clear that there are many more cases which we have not been able to document of the kidnapping of free people into slavery. And the last point I'll make before shutting up is to say that, coming at this from another historiographical direction, there have been scholars for a long time working on the free Black experience in the northern states where slavery was already dead. Studies of free Black life. I'm thinking here of scholars like Leon Litwack, Erica Dunbar, Gary Nash. It goes on and on. And scholars like that have been sounding the trumpet for generations since the 1960s that free Black life was not all milk and honey, that slavery can be dead in your state. You can have freedom papers, you can live on free soil, and yet you are by no means truly free. You live in constant, in a climate of toxic racism. Right now we'd call it white supremacy, where getting access to the basics like the right to a job, like the right to a place in school for your children, a church that you can worship in without being thrown out or made to sit in the balcony or only show up for services at 5 a.m., that racialized climate is fundamental to the experience of free Black life in northern towns and cities, whether it's Philadelphia, New York, Boston, or places further west like Cincinnati and Pittsburgh. So the natural evolution of that scholarship is to say that even legal freedom for those people living freely in the North as African Americans, even that was actually poisoned and vulnerable and contingent and fragile. And one of the sources of that fragile freedom was, of course, the predations of kidnappers participating in what I call America's reverse Underground Railroad. So there's a lot of swirling context here. I've surely missed several other big discourses here, but those are the ones that jump out at me as being significant in placing this work in a larger series of conversations, not just in America, but across the Atlantic world.
Thank you, Rick. I think that Alex has a...
Yes, I have a question from the chat. This is from Jacques Aymeric, who is in Geneva right now. It's a little late there, so you prefer if I ask the question. Says, sorry I was late, but thank you for the presentation. Unfortunately, I'm new to this club and have not yet been able to read the book. I would just like to know, did other African Americans who were slaves but were able to take advantage of the system by being foremen, for example, participate in the kidnapping or sale of freed and kidnapped slaves? Now, I already told them that, yes, the answer in the book is yes, but I wanted you to expand on that, because this is I think one of the most strong, shocking parts of the book.
Yeah, so what role did African-American people play in facilitating what I call America's reverse Underground Railroad? Now, let's be clear, this is very difficult to talk about. This is politically very fraught, and it would be lost on no one that I'm a white British man here. So let me say, however, that it is incontrovertible that there were roles played by African-American and mixed race people in facilitating the work of these white-owned and operated and run kidnapping gangs. And as Alex knows, because he's read the book, the particular kidnapping of Cornelius, Enos, Alex, Sam, and Joe, Mary Fisher, and Mary Neal is made possible by the actions of one mixed race individual whose real name was John Purnell, though he often used an alias, who preys on other dark-skinned people and uses his racial identity that he presents as Black as a way to get them to trust him, and then he exploits that trust. Now, let's be clear, he is a cog in a much larger wheel here, right? He is a frontline operative for a much larger gang, which is predominantly white folks, in fact, many of which are related to each other. It's a bit like the mafia, it's a family affair. But their terrible genius is to realize that they can succeed in their work if they employ some people who present as Black on the front lines to lure people down the wrong alley or onto the wrong ship, or to walk with them in the wrong direction. And of course, they pay handsomely. They have to persuade someone like John Purnell to swallow their own scruples and conscience and do this work. Recruiting those frontline mercenaries who presented as African-American must have been incredibly hard to do. At least I hope it was incredibly hard to do. But money talks. And remember, free Black people regardless, free black people, period, live under extraordinary stresses and have an extraordinary lack of economic opportunities. So someone coming along and offering you $50 to $100 for a week's work at a time when you might not otherwise make that sort of money in 3 months can be the sort of mountain of cash that can get your attention and make you make abhorrent moral choices, in the same way that the white kidnapping members of the gang had done. Now, I want to keep this in context here, right? We know of a tiny handful, a few dozen black and mixed race people who play that sort of role in one kidnapping gang or another, and the vast majority of kidnappers are people who look like me. And the other thing I want to say is that when we think about it, it really shouldn't surprise us to find that something as evil and insidious as kidnapping of free black people into slavery uses every trick in the book, and that an institution like America's Reverse Underground Railroad finds ways to poison African Americans against each other. In fact, that is the history of slavery in the Atlantic world more generally, right? Slavery has a particular toxicity which allows it to set black people against each other all the time, using economic wedges, using wedges of a lack of trust and competing interest. So you can find black people serving as overseers on different slave labor camps all across the Atlantic world, not because they love beating each other, but because it gives them certain privileges and keeps them safe, provides for their families. We can find informants who are African American, who sometimes give up their collaborators in plotted slave revolts, again, for self-interested reasons. You'd have to ask yourself what you would do in these situations as well. Slavery poisons people against each other. That is why slavery survives and thrives, because of that dark power. So it's actually no surprise to see it unfolding in that particular way in North America in the 1820s. I wrote an article about this, by the way, a very hard article to write, as you might imagine, in the Journal of the Early Republic, about 3 or 4 years ago, unpacking some of this and reminding folks that black people at the time were outraged and have a long history of being outraged every time they get, misled, lured away, or double-crossed by other African-American people. And in the context of America's Reverse Underground Railroad, coming down hard as possible on the kidnappers they could get their hands on was a signature response of the free black community to these predators, and more narrowly, beating the crap out of any kidnappers of color was also something they took some pleasure in, obviously, as a way to suggest that being black should be a badge of common interest against the forces of slavery and the slave power. So it actually becomes a sort of rallying moment, as not just a source of division, which I think is fascinating and useful.
Thank you, Rick. Does anybody in the audience would like to ask a question of Rick? Yes, Cassandra. Would you unmute it? There you go.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, I don't know. I have multiple questions here, but I'm thinking in part about how this fits into other things we know about this time period. And when I think about these kidnappers, they remind me of confidence men. And I wonder the degree to which that sort of culture of people being able to sort of fake their identities plays into what you're talking about. I mean, I also wonder, so much of the literature on slavery and capitalism has also shown how much legal framework is built around this, and yet you're showing something that's completely extra legal, and it's kind of miraculous, not to spoil the end, but that the legal system ends up working, and it's only by chance, not by design, as it turns out, from what I can tell in your book. So I'm just wondering, sort of, does this overturn anything we think about this period in those larger conversations, or do you see it as mostly fitting into that?
So thanks for that great question, Cassie, much appreciated. And folks who know this work will know that this is what's called a trade book. which is to say this is aimed at as larger audience of readers as possible. I want this to be the book you grab in the airport when airports exist again, and we can go back to airports, right? I want this to show up in your recommendation lists on Amazon.com. I want you to give this to your uncle for Christmas because he watches the History Channel, which you never should, never watch the History Channel. So, which is to say, this is designed to deliver some, I think, uncomfortable and unfamiliar truths to those of us who don't live and breathe this stuff every day. But there are many people in this audience who do live and breathe this stuff every day, and who are as well-versed as I am in what Ed Baptist has to say, or Walter Johnson has to say, or Erica Dunbar has to say. And so, you know, the interventions I'm making in those scholarly conversations, I think, are also real. But that's not my primary audience here. Let's bear that in mind, first of all, as a sort of stipulation here. The second half was legal. The first half was, why am I totally blanking on the first half, Cassie? Give it to me again.
Confidence men and the sort of whole culture about appearances and
no, it's so important. I can't believe I just pushed that right out. So I agree with you that fundamental to the success of any kidnapper who is not simply using bare physical force as a means to abduct someone, and plenty of kidnappers did use bare physical force, but many others used the threat of violence and a combination of what I call traps or lures or decoys. And sometimes those traps, lures, and ruses could be racial, like the presentation. I'm just like you, right? As to get someone to walk the wrong way. But white kidnappers used all sorts of tricks as well. And again, the vast majority of kidnappers were white. And so that is a form of confidence trick. I think I referred to the two guys who take Solomon Northup captive as con men, because they never lift a finger against him. In fact, they treat him real nice. They offer to pay him. They do pay him. They wine him and dine him, but then they drug him, right? They get him to trust them by asserting a false identity, that they're some sort of weird circus promoters, I think it is. It's very hard to figure out what exactly their gimmick is there if you read Northup's account. But that he's got a skill, he plays the fiddle, and that they need him to come play the fiddle in their circus. That's a series of lies. And we know that these sorts of lies were by far the most common sets of decoys, right? The use of violence is remarkably minimal, actually, in most kidnapping cases, especially when you're dealing with children. So the value of being able to spring confidence tricks rises the younger your mark, your target is, I would say. And likewise, conversely, the use of force increases the older your target is, generally speaking. There are plenty of exceptions to that. So as Cassie well knows, America in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s is swimming with confidence men and confidence women of all different stripes, operating in every possible guise. Think of card sharks. Think of certain types of sex workers who present in a certain way and gain entree to certain social circles and then make an offer in some man's ear and he walks away with them. We know, for instance, of young Irish lads, and I think who's written about this? Brendan O'Malley's written about this. Young Irish lads who meet the ships in Philadelphia, in New York, and Boston that are piled full of Irish immigrants coming to America. And they say, "You're from County Galway? I'm from County Galway. My aunt owns a boarding house round the corner. The rates are very reasonable. Would you like to come with me?" And they say, "My God, what a wonderful coincidence to meet you. That's wonderful. Can I give you some bags to take and I'll bring along the rest?" And of course, those bags are never seen again. Or if they do find an actual boarding house, the rent suspiciously triples after they put their bags down. That same presentation of mutual affinity. I know you, you know me, we are the same. That's the confidence trick. And it's finding expression in all different ways. This is the golden age of counterfeiting, as Cassie well knows from Steve Mean's work and other people, right? Joshua Greenberg has a new book about this as well. Counterfeiting is just a paper money version of a confidence trick. And all this makes sense because America, and I can overstate this easily, is rapidly urbanizing and industrializing, which means to say that certain places, towns and cities, are swimming with strangers, people who no longer know each other, who didn't grow up together. And so have to figure out who to trust. And often we get that wrong, especially when the other actor turns out to be malevolent and self-interested. So I would definitely make that connection that Cassandra did. And the legal system, we could go off in lots of different directions about that, and I hope we do. But one thing I will say just quickly is that one of the claims I try to make in the book is that even though kidnapping was illegal everywhere, it was illegal in Maryland, illegal in Mississippi, illegal in Pennsylvania, it happened anyway, like many illegal things in every place and every time. And even though there was a legal mechanism in the slave states to allow people who've been unlawfully enslaved to have their day in court and launch a freedom suit, as it's known, the practicalities of doing so posed extraordinary obstacles to people who would have benefited from doing so. So how do you know that you can have a day in court? Where do you get a lawyer from? Who pays for your legal fees and your legal services? What level of testimony from you as a Black person in a Southern court is permitted when you say, I'm not legally enslaved, I'm free? What level of corroboration do you need in the form of documents from your former life as a free person, or from witnesses, people who knew you when you were free? Do you need to be able to muster in some court in Alabama or Mississippi or Louisiana? In practice, there are giant obstacles to freedom suits ever being mounted and ever being successful. And so scholars who studied these freedom suits in much greater depth, like Kim Welch, Kelly Kennington, and Twitty, have shown that despite the availability of that sort of freedom suit machinery, the number of wrongfully enslaved people who actually get their day in court is very small, and the number of people who win those cases is terrifyingly low, for all the reasons I just gave. So it's a minor miracle on those rare occasions when someone who has been unlawfully enslaved is actually able to successfully use the legal system to extricate themselves and emancipate themselves from slavery, as, spoiler alert, one of these people is able to do in this book.
Thank you, Rick. And I think Dan Broyle has a question. I don't know, Dan, if you want to still ask it. Do you want to unmute yourself? Dan?
Yeah, cheers. How's everything?
Hi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bell, for your presentation this evening. I just have, I kind of have three kind of small questions. One, just out of curiosity to know your history and background in African-American history, because I've looked at some of your other work and I was just trying to, divulge that.
Yes.
But also too, your using of the word reverse Underground Railroad. I find that, perhaps, I just wonder about the wording and, could it perhaps be kind of problematic? And then the last question, and I've read the book and I know I've seen this somewhere, and you mentioned in your talk, tens of thousands of people going on the reverse Underground Railroad. And so I just wanted to kind of pin down an actual number. I don't know if I've seen it somewhere in the book, or I'm trying to remember because I read it expeditiously.
So great. Let me try and take those. Don't let me forget all three, right? Because as you heard, I'm bad at keeping questions in my head. So let's take them maybe in reverse order. So numbers, first of all. So what you will see me say in print and on occasions like this is thousands, maybe tens of thousands, that sort of formulation. You're not going to see me say on page 42, Dan, it was 42,000 people between 1808 and 1860. And I think we both understand why I'm not able or willing actually to put more specificity on it. It's because we're dealing with criminal activity here, most of which went, legally speaking, undetected. Detected, of course, by the people to whom it was happening and their loved ones, but didn't always register in a police record, for instance, certainly not in a trial transcript, or anyone being legally liberated, or anyone being held to account for their crimes. If we just counted, kidnapping convictions and used that as our number, we'd have a couple of hundred, right? But if we looked at newspaper coverage and we looked at missing persons ads, we'd suddenly have a much larger number. To read newspapers in the 80s, I've just been Zoom bombed by my 4-year-old, so I'm keeping an eye on her. Hold on a second. Coming in or going out, Rose? I think she's lurking. So I'll try and just press on. What was I saying? My wife's just now run in to grab her. This is what's happening off stage. It's just like in that BBC clip with that BBC dude.
My trousers are fully up.
Yeah. We all have our trousers on. My wife wants you to know. So what was I saying there? This is being recorded, right? This is being recorded. That's excellent. Dan, so newspaper missing persons ads, to get back to very serious stuff, are actually everywhere. If you open a newspaper in Philly, in New York, in Charleston, in Boston, etc., in these places in the 1820s and 30s, you will find missing persons ads saying, my child is gone. I think he or she has been kidnapped. Please help me get them back. These are not uncommon things. If we look at editorials and activist literature, if we look at the records of some anti-slavery groups where records survive, and I'm thinking here about the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, we can see that their caseload and their meeting minutes are dominated by what on earth are we going to do about this kidnapping crisis? There's yet another case, and then another one, and then another one that we're being asked to do something about. And what can we do? We're just a bunch of Quaker lawyers in Pennsylvania. We're not that rich, and we have no jurisdiction in Mississippi. What can we do? So there's no one body of sources, Dan, that tells us with any accuracy how big this is. So you have to put all these bodies of sources together and then be honest about what you're looking at. And so I would say to you that in 10 years of working on this, I was personally able to document many, many hundreds of these cases in some fragmentary fashion or other. And I wasn't looking to document all these other cases. These are the ones that popped into my lap as I was researching this case. So if I'm finding this slice, then how big is the pie? And then you sort of have to extrapolate there. And so you end up with vague locutions like thousands, if not tens of thousands. And that's incredibly vague. But I also want to point out that historians who've been working on the Underground Railroad, Networks to Freedom, they can't be much more specific. And they've been working on this for 150 years, right? They face all the same source problems, though in a slightly different form that I do. And so, you know, if you read great works on the Underground Railroad, like, you know, biographies of Harriet Tubman, for instance, by Kate Larson or Catherine Clinton, or Eric Foner's Gateway to Freedom, which is the most recent, or Richard Blackett, A Captive's Quest for Freedom, you will find, again, vague locutions that say thousands, maybe tens of thousands. So that gives me some confidence of comparing these two things. So that's that. We could say a lot more about that, but that's that. The middle one was reverse Underground Railroad. Yes, I agree. That is not the best term. If you have a better term, which communicates what happened and grabs the attention of your uncle who watches the History Channel, then let me know what it is. Because the goal here was to give a name to something that actually didn't have a name. A synonym would be, you know, this is the kidnapping and trafficking into slavery of free African Americans, primarily from northern towns or cities. Do you put that in your book title? I didn't even put America's Reverse Underground Railroad in mine because I was ginger, you know, nervous about how this would go across. I totally agree that comparing these two phenomena, which have some similarities, but have incredibly important differences, is controversial, let's say. Now, in my defense, I'm not sure why I should feel on the defensive, but here you go. In my defense, I would say that if you Google the phrase reverse Underground Railroad, you'll be taken, among other places, to a Wikipedia page, which says that this term has been around for a long time, especially on the internet, especially among folklorists and genealogists and African-American activists, that this is not my term. This is a term I'm borrowing and mainstreaming to describe what other people have already described this way. Again, I sound defensive when I say this. The other part of this would be to say that it does need to have a name that is better than the longer one. And I do think this name, America's Reverse Underground Railroad, commands attention because it is controversial and because it makes you think about what might be the likely scale of kidnapping and enslavement. Because we all understand, don't we, that the Underground Railroad was a big deal, that lots of people fought their way to freedom. So if that's true, then my God, lots of people must have had their freedom stolen from them. So it gets you to think about magnitude, which is one reason I actually like it. I agree it flattens all sorts of important differences, but here we are. And then the last thing was my own background. Yeah, like many scholars, I've been on a journey of discovery as I've moved around my career. I don't want to write the same book 3 times over or find myself in one very small niche of historiography for the rest of my life. My first book was about suicide in American history. It was a cultural history, actually, not a social or a political history, a cultural history of suicide between the Revolution and the Civil War. I wrote an edited book of essays about the experience of incarceration in America. And my next book, which is in the very early stages, is about the fight to desegregate mass transit in New York in the Civil War. So this is my most overt pivot to African-American history. But I think if you looked at my other works, which aren't as clearly African-American history, you would find African-American actors and the freedom struggle actually, pretty close to the surface in all of that. And to put that more narrowly, the last chapter and the best chapter of my suicide book was the one in which I tried to think about why it was that white anti-slavery activists and some African-American anti-slavery activists seized on the suicides of enslaved people in their moral suasion output, their pamphlets. What did they see in a slave's unalloyed suffering that they thought could move the needle in the anti-slavery fight? And after I worked on that chapter, I couldn't look away from the freedom struggle any longer. And the last thing I'll say about this, Dan, is, this may sound horribly cliche and pat, but I've come to the conclusion belatedly in my career as an historian that the freedom struggle is the fundamental story of America. That if you're not looking at this and engaging with this in some way, then you've got your head buried in the sand. So this has been a journey for me. Thanks for the great questions.
Thank you, Rick, for that answer. I think we have Idris next. Idris, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Are you still there with us, Idris? Let me see. I think we may have lost her. I don't see her in the participants. All right. So perhaps whilst
it's him. I think
it's him. Sorry.
Yes. I think it's him. Oh, I don't see as well. I think that
he may have
left. Mm-hmm.
So while Susanna Ashton says goodbye, she has another commitment. But I did have one question. While perhaps those who remain with us formulate another. I too am moved by this sort of trend in connecting the domestic market to the rise of capitalism, putting it at the core of American history. And I was particularly struck by your argument in the second half, sort of trying to explain for us why folks like Henderson and others made this move. And you advocate on the side of PR, of public relations, that is conscious of some kind of long-term strategy, that wants to keep the peace between the North and the South, that understands there is a reciprocal relationship there, and this is their way of, doing their part, perhaps a little different than, the way that sort of the GOP strategy of today has given up on this kind of exchange. But in any case, not to derail myself, I saw you not actually going in direction in which I would have gone to, which would be that there was an economic interest for the legal slave traders to actually fight against those who were driving down the prices. Mm-hmm. But you don't go there. Is this? I'm sure you have thought about this. Why don't you make the economic argument? You make a sort of like it's there between the lines. It's just not explicitly said. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what those economic pressures were.
Yeah, happy to. And this might be a bit in the weeds for folks who have not yet read that part of the book, but I think you gave a nice summary of it. So the context here, folks, is that some of these boys eventually make some very surprising white allies in the state of Mississippi in particular. Among them, a white lawyer whose business depends on serving slave-owning clients. Among them, a slaveholder himself. And among them, briefly, the Attorney General of the state of Mississippi, also a slave owner. Two of these guys were transplants from the Philadelphia area, but that's perhaps not as important as you might actually think it is, at least I would argue. So I argue that why they're helping is a mystery that needs an answer, that it needs unraveling, because it's against our expectations that any slavery-dependent white folks in a state like Mississippi are going to lift a finger to help an enslaved person who claims they're free. There are lots of enslaved people claiming they're free. Who's to know who's telling the truth, right? Slavery would collapse if you went around saying, "Are you free? Tell me the truth," right? You'd get a lot of people saying, "Yeah, I'm definitely free." As I would too if I was in that situation. So why do these people help? Or why do they lend particular types of assistance to some of these boys? That was a mystery I wanted to find an answer to. I think there are multiple answers to that, and I hope that you can find them actually being woven together in the narrative that you have. And the one that comes to the surface most clearly is the one Alex put his finger on there, which is that office holders in particular, and future office holders. The lawyer is a very ambitious guy with his eye on a national career. The Attorney General of the state of Mississippi is already a statewide office holder with his eye on a national career, though he will die quickly. These guys are very interested in not just burnishing Mississippi's reputation for the sake of it, but being seen to do so as a way to send the message to Northerners that Philadelphia is not the Wild West, that Philadelphia is a place of laws, a place where property rights and freedoms are respected, a place where you can safely invest and where you can safely migrate to. And remember, Mississippi in the 1820s, like Alabama, like Louisiana, these are new states. What they're desperate for is investment of every possible sort, the investment of humans, the investment of time, the investment of money in all its forms, literally venture capital to pour into Mississippi. So they have every interest as representatives of the governing class of Mississippi or stakeholders to make sure that that is Mississippi's reputation. And as you can imagine, at a time when slavery is growing and thriving, they have to work their damnedest to get Mississippi any sort of good PR, to use Alex's term. And so I would argue actually that economics and PR are one and the same. They're two sides of the same coin. And just to burrow deeper on Alex's point, Alex said that one of the reasons why those invested in legal slavery in Mississippi might want to push back against illegal slavery is to better protect the legal slave trade and their right to own human beings as slaveholders. And I wholeheartedly agree with the logic of that claim. I couldn't find specific evidence that I could quote you in the book to make that claim for these three individuals. So I didn't make that claim about these three individuals in particular. But what we can say is that many legal slave traders who built legal fortunes, legally trading people from Maryland to Mississippi, from Virginia to Louisiana, many of those legal slave traders, and they have names, by the way, they have firms, they have companies. Franklin and Armfield is a very famous company beginning in the 1820s and thriving in the 1830s. Our colleague Josh Rothman is writing a book, which is coming out soon from Basic Books, about Franklin and Armfield. Austin Woolfolk in the 1810s and 1820s. These legal slave traders, there are many more, have everything to be gained by distancing themselves any way they can from America's reverse Underground Railroad in public. Even if they deal with those guys privately, in public, they have to be seen to keep them at arm's length, and they have to be seen to decry and denounce kidnapping wherever they can, because they want to separate in the public imagination kidnapping and slave trading. Guess what, guys? These are not the same. One's legal and one's not. Don't ever confuse the two. Now, morally speaking, it's all man-stealing, right? We all know this. But they want to make sure those two things are kept separate. So as Robert Goodmestad, Gudmestad, has written in a brilliant book called A Troublesome Commerce, we can find all sorts of slave owners and certainly all of the leading slave traders in the legal slave trade trying to decry and denounce kidnapping as loudly as they can as a way to insulate themselves and their own business. So that's certainly going on here, as is the comity, the PR, the economics. It's all messed up in a horrible, evil stew. So the idea that you would help some victims of kidnapping as a way to protect your own economic prospects and the legal domestic slave trade is, I hope, the argument that most readers will walk away from with.
Thank you, Rick. I don't see any other question, but if anybody has one question, one final question for Rick, please come forward. If not, we wanted to actually always keep this organic, and if it feels like the right moment to close this, then I ask you to join me in thanking Rick for having this conversation with us. And for those of you who have not read the book, please go get this book and read it. It's such a great read. Rick, if you yourself had any parting words for us, this would be a good moment.
Yes,
and also I have also just after Rick concludes, just to call the next one in January. But just go ahead, Rick.
No, so first of all, thank you for these wonderful questions. It's always nice to have a chance to burrow deeply into some of the big issues here and to be challenged on some of the assertions and interpretations and evidence here, right? That's the nature of historical discourse. So I particularly welcome that opportunity. And the last thing, doing my publisher's bidding, I want to remind folks that the paperback just came out. It's very cheap from very many places. You can find it in your library and on Jeff Bezos's little mom and pop site that he's built and many other places. There's a great audio book. It's not read by me, in case you were wondering. It's read by someone with a lovely American accent from New York, an actor named Leon Nixon. He's really good. And if anyone would like a signed copy of the book, I'm happy to make arrangements about that. Just send me an email at my email address, which is rjbell@umd.edu, and you can find that just by Googling Richard Bell, Maryland as well. Thank you for this opportunity, Alex and Anna. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today.
Thank you for joining us. Anna, you want to tell us a little bit about what's next for us?
Yeah, then just first of all, do not forget, this is the book Stolen by Richard Bell, and it's available, of course, online and in all the other outlets that he just mentioned. I have, of course, the hardcover, but he just mentioned that the paperback was just released. And I would like to invite you that we are going to start again the book club. You are going to reconvene in January. January the 6th is going to be a Wednesday at 5 p.m. And you'll be discussing the book African Women in the Atlantic World. This is an edited book by historian Mariana Cândido and Adam Jones, with several women historians indeed, and Black women historians focusing then each chapter focusing on a different dimension of the experiences of women with different status than Black women with different statuses during the era of the Atlantic slave trade, before and beyond. Then you are invited to join us. You have slaveryarchive.wordpress.com. We have the entire program there. You can register for the session on January the 6th, or you can register for the next ones, because you are going to have nearly every 2 weeks a different session. And I want to thank Alex for co-hosting the meeting, and especially to thank Richard Bell for presenting his great book in the session. And to all those of you who joined us today, this talk is going to stay on YouTube, then you can revisit it if you missed the beginning. You can also assign to your students as the next semester is coming soon. Then the Slavery Archive Book Club is a tool that you can use in class if you want. Otherwise, we wish you all good holidays and restful break. Stay healthy and safe. Thank you.